All right. So the final topic before we turn you loose and say go create IGs is about IG quality, but in a slightly different mode than Melva talked about it this morning. This is not about checkboxes and satisfying various HL7 policies. It's what's going to create stuff that's useful, that the community will actually like and use and get you to your desired endpoint, which is people implementing your stuff. And I'm up here by nature of the fact that I'm super opinionated in this space. Just a little bit. Yeah. I could lecture you and tell you all the things that you're supposed to do, but it's mid-afternoon and lecture is not a great format and you don't want to listen to me anyhow. So what I thought I would do is turn this into a discussion. And benefit for me of being a discussion is you will undoubtedly identify some quality criteria or quality guidelines that I haven't written down yet, and I have written down a whole bunch, and I'll show you where they are shortly. But I'd like to just have a discussion about, I presume all of you, given that you're here to learn how to create IGs, have seen at least one FHIR IG in your past. Hopefully many of you, or hopefully or not, many of you have seen a lot of them. And you have undoubtedly formed some opinions about what is good, what is not so good, and or have questions about, so I've seen this and I've seen this and I don't know which of the two is better. Is one of those things better? And of course this is going to drive mic sharing people crazy because we're about to have everybody in the room talking. And so sorry to the people at the back for doing that, but I think for the people in the room it's going to be most valuable, and for the people not in the room, I will try to synthesize whatever we come up with today into the notes that I've already got on, and Melva's sitting there with 2 mics just ready to go, which is awesome. So we will try to synthesize all of this into documentation for those who are not present here. So I'm going to open up the question, what makes for a good IG?
Maybe I'll answer that with another question.
Sure.
About just sort of when you think about quality as it relates to an IG, what is quality? I mean, because I can think of quality from a number of perspectives, whether that's fitness for purpose from a clinical requirements perspective, or fitness for, a structural quality. Does it adhere to the spec? I can think of it, there's also from a semantic consistency perspective. Does this implementation guide have greater semantic consistency than this? And I guess it'd be helpful to know how you're thinking about quality.
Yeah, and the reality is it's sort of all of those things, and guidelines that help increase the likelihood of any of those things is fair game for this. That we have a bunch of tooling infrastructure that tries to enforce technical validity, so it's pretty hard, although occasionally, unfortunately, not impossible, to define artifacts that are at odds with what the core specification says. And it's, however, much easier to create artifacts that don't fit what the end community needs, or that use terms in ways that is inconsistent with how other artifacts use the same terms, or even how the community uses the terms. And that tends to be harder for tooling to enforce. Or, yep.
Okay, I'll give it to you next. One of the tensions that I see with IGs is that it seems like there's 2 groups of people that would want to use this. And one are programmers like myself who really want technical detail. Mm-hmm. And the other are people that don't ever want to program and don't want to see a lot of technical detail. And I don't really have an answer for that, but I've seen in the working groups a lot of tension between putting in more detail, making it more understandable for a less technical audience. And again, I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's a concern.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the keys from my perspective is that our primary audience is typically the software developer. That's who in the end we need to read the implementation guide, turn it into code, and actually do something with it. So it has to work for them. If it doesn't work for them, we're not actually going to get stuff implemented. At the same time, it needs to actually propagate to those people. And generally the software developers are not the people who are going to look at the implementation guide and say, this is a good idea. So you do actually have to hit both audiences. You need to have the first part of your IG, the introductory level of your IG, explain in relatively non-technical terms and non-expert terms what the heck you're trying to do and why, and how this IG is a good and useful thing, and who it's for, who it's relevant to, and who it's not. So that an analyst or a CTO or somebody who is making these kinds of decisions can look at it and say, okay, this looks like something we need to pay attention to, and then toss it to a technical person who can then look it over and say, yes, we can do this, or no, this is out to lunch, and here's roughly how long it's going to take us. The challenge that we've had in the past at HL7 is that we often haven't hit either of those audiences. We have not done a great job of explaining to people who are not insiders what the heck this is for and why it matters. And we have also written tons and tons and tons and tons of stuff that software developers have little use for reading. And so creating your implementation guide in a way that lets the software developer skim and understand and certainly estimate how long it's going to take to do this in an hour or so is sort of what your target is. And having it so that a non-technical person can skim it in 20 minutes and say, yes, this is relevant, or no, this is not relevant, are sort of targets. And yes, there's a need to have additional documentation about rationale and all of the edge cases that can exist out there, but it shouldn't get in the way of doing the straightforward stuff.
That was really well said, Lloyd. It's because if you can't get it to the person, if you can't argue for it in an organization, you're not going to get to the developer ever. So thank you for that. My biggest concern is pretty trivial, actually, but when I look at the tabs across the top, they're all sorts of ways formatted. And you never know, like, if there isn't an artifact index, if there really isn't one, but it's under one of the other tabs. And like I look at this page that's up there right now, at the top you have IG Home and Table of Contents, but then whatever page you're on also has Table of Contents and IG Home. When I go to review these IGs, I hit the same pages often many times because I'm going through this sort of logical process of trying to hit every page, and you hit the same pages twice. And it gets really confusing. Wait, I thought I read this. Oh, I did. It was linked off this. It sounds really trivial, but when I go to look at something, it would be really nice if I could count on some degree of consistency there.
Yeah, and that's two things. That's template. So moving to a common template will help there. But even the template that we have allows for customization of what is in the menu and how the menu is organized. And we do need to come to consensus around what is a good or ideal menu structure.
So would we have maybe certain things that always have to be there, and then you can only customize other things?
We absolutely could, and I think we should.
Extensible menu?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I have in my last 5 or 6 IGs sort of standardized on this layout of there's always a way to get home, there's always a table of contents, although perhaps that is redundant with this and we could get rid of it.
Where does IG Home take you if not the table of contents?
It takes you here. So So this is the home page. The table of contents page is this.
But in some IGs, that's the first tab.
Yep. I mean, coming here as the first entry point to an IG to me is not that useful. Because it basically says you must click twice in order to get to something useful. And I'm a firm believer in you shouldn't ever have to click twice to get to something useful. So
for that second audience that we're speaking of,
yeah,
they don't like to click.
They do not like to click. So this is the thing that I want everybody to see right away, because this is the part that explains why this IG matters. And I tried to adhere to that principle here of the very first few paragraphs are not technical and are explain what the heck an implementation guide is for those people who might not know. And then we get into a bit more specifics here, and I'll probably beef up the technical details a bit more still for the people who care about IG Publisher and all that kind of stuff. But these first few paragraphs, you don't need to be an HL7 member. You don't need to have come to this class to understand, okay, this is what this is for, this kind of makes sense to me. So that's the separation between your home page and your table of contents. Your table of contents is a way of making sure that you can see what are all the pages that exist. And if you're a person who wants to make sure that I have read every single page, because there are hyperlinks that go all over the place, because sometimes it makes sense to be able to jump from I'm at the home page and now I want to jump into a particular profile and then I want to jump to an example and I want to jump somewhere else. You can miss stuff. So the table of contents sort of tells you what everything exists and how it's organized.
So simple IGs, the table of contents doesn't say anything useful that the home page doesn't, and vice versa, because there's not many pages and it's better to just to collapse them together, and that means that you can use the menu links to reach further into the implementation guide, and that's fit for purpose for that implementation guide. But as your implementation guide gets bigger and broader and more stuff gets thrown into it, you need a full table of contents, and it's a big long thing that's useful for systematic navigation, and then you split off the home page, and then you have to have your links go to other pages that summarize links and context and other kinds of relevant tables of contents. So it's kind of hard for me to imagine really making very hard rules about how to guide the user through every implementation guide in one single way.
Yeah, it may be that we can't. It may be that we have 2 or 3 or 4 styles, but I'd rather a few common styles than have everybody invent their own mechanism where there isn't necessarily even always an artifact list, there isn't necessarily even always a table of contents.
Someone just created a task for us to have implementation guides without any artifacts. I can't think who that might have been.
This is actually one. There are no artifacts in this IG.
So what does the artifact index have?
So I would rather
Excellent question. It's
like
empty.
I would rather see that, like, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, Linda?
Linda, yeah.
Like Linda said, I would rather see if there's sort of a set quote unquote standard types of information. I'd rather see it and see there are no artifacts than wonder if I missed it.
Yep.
But I had a really quick question, and which was just, how did you know? Can you tell me how to get to this page? Because and maybe I missed it, but
I didn't tell anybody, so
okay.
you didn't miss it, and I wasn't going to.
Oh, is it secret?
Well,
Super secret?
because I've got all my ideas about what good quality
Okay.
is buried in here.
Oh, I see. Never mind.
And I was going to mine you guys before I had you go look, and then I'll let you look, and then you can riff off of that.
I have one other thing. It's not unusual to FHIR, but making sure all of the diagrams, pictures, whatever, have identification on them so that when you're trying to refer to them in whatever context, even for trackers or internally or whatever, you don't have to say the third diagram following 1.1 introduction, type thing. I noticed U.S. Core doesn't have numbers right now. I don't know why. I know.
So hi, I have a few points. So one, I really like it when there's an explanation behind some of the choices that are made in the IG. For example, on the FHIR, the Smart Application Launch Framework IG, I love that for the capability statement, they require both the FHIR capability statement and the well-known URI, and they explain that they require both because the spec is transitioning away from the capability statement. Whereas in like the bulk FHIR capability statement, it's a may requirement, and they don't really describe why it's may for the conformance statement, whereas it's required for like the smart auth guide. And then inside of US core, I think it's a bit, I think the must support is all very confusing. And I think it's nice when there's not like different levels of definitions of must support. So like the flags versus cardinality, and the fact that, you know, there's this concept that was taken from HL7v2, which is the required but maybe empty, but it seems like the cardinality should be able to meet
No.
that.
Must support and cardinality are completely different things.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm just saying, I think as a reader, it would help if this was all just clearer, because the flag of support versus cardinality is confusing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I look for in most IGs is sort of a prerequisite section that says you need to be familiar with the following things before this IG is going to make sense to you. Mm-hmm. And certainly understanding what must support is and how that's different from cardinality is a key thing to wrap your head around before any profile that you look at is going to make any sense at all. Because if you don't know the difference between those two things, you're going to look at it and go, well, I don't know what this is trying to tell me. But I don't think we can mush those things together. The only thing that we can do is try to educate people into what the difference is.
I haven't seen this flags in another IG. Is this unique to US Core?
Must support? No, it's all over the place.
Okay, great. Okay.
In some places, it doesn't exist where it should.
Got it.
But typically, must support is how you set expectations for what systems are going to do, as opposed to what data must appear in every single instance.
This is a really key issue for communities and implementation guide authors. And we argue about three things. We argue about must support, we argue about should versus shall, and we argue about binding strength between required and extensible and max value set. And really, what we're trying to do is square a circle here, because on the one hand, you want to lean on people so that the majority use cases are done well. And so you want to use strong language to say you've just got to do this, but then you've got all the weird corner cases where you just can't do this, and you can't make the important these corner use cases impossible. You can't say to someone, you can't get sick in this unusual way, or you can't, have this unusual process. And so we're constantly tripping over because the communities are like, no, we want to say, you've got to use the right code. You can't use the code unless you use the right code. And then it turns out that this case is where you can't use the right code, and you do want to use the code after all. And so I watch communities, sub-communities within FHIR and V2 and CDA and DICOM and so forth go backwards and forwards on this line as we want to push people to do things right, but if we don't force them to do it right, they'll just ignore us. But if we force them to do it right, then there's some things you just can't do. And we go round and round in circles. And I think that being able to explain that clearly to communities is a key role of the IG author, is to say, I know what these different various things are, and I know the subtle implications. For instance, extensible value set bindings. We all hate extensible value set bindings. And anybody who hasn't run backwards and forwards over the borderline of extensible bindings will immediately say, well, that's a stupid thing. Just figure out your codes and make them required. And that is the same as holding a flag up saying, I haven't walked this path yet. Because none of us like them. We got there because we have to have them, not because we like them. But understanding the subtleties of the conformance language around not minimum max, which everybody gets really easy, but all the ins and outs of the subtleties of shall and should and required and how the validator uses those. I think of that as a key function of the IG author in their ongoing relationship in terms of catalysing the community to come to a clear view of how they want to do this. But I think it's one of the enduring hard parts. And, you know, we've been doing Argonaut for 4 years and we're still arguing about this in Argonaut this week. Last week anyway, we were arguing about this. So it's not an issue that's going to go away anytime soon. But it's not an issue that can go away either. We need to get that right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I had one more. So also, I think it's good when IGs are explicit about mays and shoulds and shalls. There are areas like in the bulk IG and operations where it's not explicitly stated whether these three operations are may or should or shall, and I think that could be confusing to folks. So, and it's maybe an assumed may if it's not stated. So,
assumptions, you know what they mean.
I'm happy I already hit that for tomorrow's tutorial.
Okay, others.
A few topics. So if you mentioned the IDs on pictures, could we have a naming convention better than IDs? Just thinking of, so I do this via PanDoc. I take a Word document and I convert it into the thingy. So that comes up with a naming convention. It says it takes the page name and the picture 1, picture 2, picture 3. So and I think it's better than an ID. So if you force that there has to be an identifier of some sort, then this might clash with that. It's a minor thing.
I interpreted this as something like figure 1.
Yeah.
In page 1.
No. There is no such thing as page 1, really. I mean, I would expect pictures to be unique within a single page and numbered within a single page, but they would not be numbered across the IG.
I wonder. I'm wondering, we don't have page numbers.
We have section numbers.
We have section numbers. I'm wondering if I can number, decorate images with a figure number directly. Just the problem with that is telling which images I'm actually supposed to number, because images appear all over the place. And you don't think of them as figures, they're just an image that your eyes ran over without noticing them. So maybe that would be a bit tough. But I mean, it generally applies. So just go back to your implementation guide there, Lloyd, and go down the page a little bit. So we have, so I want to point out to you, just go back, run your mouse next to on technical details there. So how many of you have noticed this little link icon? Right, the link icon is really key because that's a link that points directly to there. So if you right click on the link and choose copy, you've got a URL that points to that part of the page. And that, as the page gets reorganized, that will move around with the content as long as you, the author, keep that, because you put the name in there. If you don't put a name in there, I make up a name. So if you put a name in there, it moves around as you reorganize the page. Whereas if you introduce a section above this, the numbers will get renumbered. So the name link that you put in the Markdown or the HTML in your narrative is solid and moves with the content. So we encourage particularly if you're going to comment on a current build, the numbers are all over the place in a current build. I've looked at heaps and heaps of tasks saying section 1.2 in the current build. Well, who the hell knows what they were looking at? You have no idea what they were looking at. Whereas if you copy the URL, it's a reasonably good chance they'll still know what you were looking at because that moves with the content.
If people remember to put in anchor names. Yeah.
But I could maybe put one of those little icons next to the figure. I'll have to have a play with whether I can correctly recognise which figures are actually figures.
Well, we can. What?
When you insert the figure into the IG, can you do something that makes
The trouble is I don't insert a figure into the IG, I insert an image. And images are all over the place.
No, I mean, but when the author of the IG inserts an image that would need a tag.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to.
Oh, yeah, it has to be on.
I have to play with the options on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can figure out a way for us to do that easily enough with HTML. Markdown's going to be more fun.
No, just to be clear, I was just thinking that the pages that you, as an author, put in the pages section, that there is an images folder. And it's not page number as the it's not a page number, it's more the page name. So if you have a page index dot something, this would be the index image 1 and then index image 2 if you have your front page. So numbering them by page would help. For that tooling purpose, it's a minor requirement or idea.
We'll see what we can do there.
Sure. The other thing, on the menu section still, we should aim for a fine or better structure, but that should not prevent others from doing their own stuff. For example, I'm thinking IG would possibly follow the volume structure there, where we have volume 1, which is a more functional description, then volume 2, which is a technical description of content, volume 3, more transactions, and then the other one for internal. We should be able to do that. Someone else might do something else.
IHE can do anything it can imagine and can technically figure out a way to make work. So we're not going to try to impose restrictions on you at all. I mean, you can take a look at the restrictions we choose to impose on ourselves and decide if those make sense for you. But there's no expectation that you would have to adhere to those. Okay,
and finally, are we looking at skins or themes from Jekyll to change the way of looking of this more radically, or not? As a more printable thing. So this is hardly printable.
Our longer-term plan is that we will have different skins for FHIR versus CDA versus V2, which are all eventually theoretically supposed to publish using this mechanism, and different skins as well for DaVinci and projects like that. I would certainly love to see some fairly radical changes in how we handle menuing and various other things and make this easier to read and less, I mean, there's some problems with how I got this rendered, which are partly because it's super zoomed and partly because some stuff is broken. But more than half of this screen is heading stuff right now. That's not nice. So there's absolutely stuff that we could do there. And my expectation is that we will see some proposals for what would we think if it looked like this, what would we think if it looked like this. And then because we have templates now, it should not be a huge pain to create a template variant and then build 7 different fairly distinct IGs against the different template variants and see what they look like and say, yeah, that was a really cool idea, but it totally blows up on these 2 IGs, so we need to refactor. That's now possible. It's not going to happen in 2019, but it certainly is my hope that it'll be something that we will embark on in 2020, is come up with some nicer ways of rendering stuff and maybe even find a sponsor who has professional UI folks who can help us with some of this.
And I have a question. Thank you. I have a question about sort of the intersection between process and quality. And I recall earlier on, there was sort of like, no errors by this state or warnings by this state. Is there some place that kind of gets into a little more detail about, what warnings are okay when, what errors are okay when?
So the general premise so there's different rules for core than there are for IGs. The rule for core is that there shouldn't be any warnings or errors, though you can suppress certain warnings. For errors, if there are some present and you can demonstrate that they are caused by the tools as opposed to by your content. So an example is the one I showed yesterday with SDC, where it was generating code on 2 different pages and linking from page 1 to page 2, and the way it was linking wasn't correct. I have zero control over that as an IG author. Ideally, the tools, you'll report that several weeks in advance of publication, and Graham or I will look at it and fix it, and by the time you get to publication, there won't be any errors. But the ideal world doesn't, or the real world doesn't work that way, and sometimes by the time you get to publication, it's made it up to number 17 on Graham's list, which is pretty high on Graham's list, and it still isn't done. And in that case, we'll look at the severity of it and say, you know what, this is 3 links out of several tens of thousands, and if somebody happens to hit that one and give you a negative ballot, then you can find it persuasive and it'll be fixed by the time we actually publish, and that's not a problem. But things that are your fault, the expectation is you fix them all. If you want to say, I can't possibly fix them all and the ONC is breathing down my neck and we really have to publish or we're going to lose $2 million, then you can come and chat with the FMG and maybe the TSC, and maybe we'll let you publish and maybe we won't. There's always the possibility for discussion. In terms of warnings, a warning means this might be an error, but my computer algorithm isn't smart enough to tell. A human has to look at it and figure out whether it's really a problem or not. So maybe you are pointing to a code and you're using a display name that is not recognized, but we don't pretend that we necessarily know all of the code translations that exist in other languages and whatever, and maybe it exists and we just haven't been told about it. So please, human, go take a look and see if it's allowed or not. And if you look at it and say, yes, this is fine, then we're good. And similarly, we have warnings that say if you're going to have a reference, you should have a display. So if you reference patient 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you should have a display that says Mary Smith, because that's good practice. But maybe in your particular implementation guide, you don't allow that because it's patient identifiable information or something like that, and that's prohibited. So you say, well, no, I don't have it, and I don't have it for a good reason, and therefore I'm going to suppress this. That's fine. Put it into your ignore list, put a comment that explains why, and we won't bug you about it.
Thank you.
Generally, your errors and warnings are technical debt that come due before you can publish, and so it's a bad idea to let them get out of control. But we haven't generally, like broken links. Broken links are really annoying because it's really easy to find a broken link, but sometimes it's really obscure what you're going to do about it. So I think that, it's a bad idea to let them endure. Coding errors as well, you should, if you think that there's, you should not let them stand. We've seen plenty of editors who've to me, this is the single most biggest category error in the FHIR community, driven by all the people with extensive V2 experience who just underappreciate terminology. And they just let their terminology errors grow and grow and grow, and they can't face them. They don't know how to solve them. None of them have quick solutions. And then they come to us going, can you just publish anyway? The terminology is a disgrace. Well, that's a hard challenge for us then. So don't let your terminology get out of control. Those two are the things that stick out to me.
I have a question about the visual part of this. Are you all 508 compliant?
No. Would we like to be? Yes. So it's one of those processes that is not cheap or easy to go through, and it's also not something that necessarily makes a ton of sense for us to go through when we are still experimenting with what is the good way to do stuff. But once we have revamped our look and feel to a point where we think, you know what, we could be happy with this for the next 5 years, then we will almost certainly be looking for somebody who needs the content to be 508 compliant to help us go through that process.
Do you get a specification into a profile? So I generate lots of the HTML.
Not from here because I got no profiles.
Okay, and I've worked really hard to make sure that the HTML that's generated is linear and regular, which is the fundamental underpinning for getting 508 right. But yeah, go look, just SDC questionnaire, one of them will do. Now go and look at the differential. It's you know, basically meaningless to talk about 508 once you start getting with content like that, right? So it's sort of...
Saying like the easy stuff, like that yellow box would flag on a 508 reader. The yellow box on top of all these IGs. The contrast between the black and the yellow signifies something. There's quite a few colourblind people in our community, and we've done a little bit of research on the colourblind stuff, and generally we rate okay on the colour blindness. It's when you know, for people who are actually visually impaired rather than colour impaired, where it starts getting harder. So we did a bit of work on colour blindness. Have we talked about the yellow box since it came up? We haven't, have we?
No.
I want to talk about that for a minute. Okay. So every page on every HL7 implementation guide must have this box. Okay, and it's got a particular byte sequence before and after it.
And you shouldn't have to worry about it if you use the template.
Yeah, if you use the template, you have to worry about it. And I replace this content on an ongoing basis. This is dynamic content. As a new version of the spec is published, this will be updated on the previously published specifications. So Lynn and I do that. So this is automatically replaced, and so every page has to have the 2 magic byte sequences and present what's in between them in this style. Okay, so that's a rule for HL7 implementation guides. The same rule applies for any implementation guide running through the current build infrastructure. It has to have that byte sequence, and you have to style it distinctly. You don't necessarily have to use the same style, but you have to style it so it appears on the continuous build with a marker saying that this is a continuous build, CI build, because that's a HL7 management requirement for us, that we have to have this box there. If you publish an implementation guide outside HL7, for instance your IG, and you're not using the continuous build, or even if you use a continuous build but you're publishing a milestone, you are not required to have this. But you should, because this is what orientates people. When they go to a page of an old specification, it will say, you are looking at an old specification, click here for the current page. Right? It's a good idea to have this box and to use our publication tooling that maintains the set of files that are your website, so that this is kept current and correct and orientates everybody the same way. But it's a policy that you require that for the CI build and for HL7 published guides. It's just advice otherwise. Any questions about that?
Can you pass the mic?
It's using Eric's template, so it doesn't have the exact wording or that. So would that be an issue, or should we tell them to?
Are you looking at the published DEQM or the CI build?
CI build.
It should have exactly equivalent wording.
Yeah, it's just much shorter, so I don't know if it needs to be exactly the same to keep current to whatever your update is.
This hasn't been rebuilt in the last 6 weeks. That's what it used to say.
Okay, so once rebuilt, it should be okay.
Yeah, once it gets rebuilt, it'll go up to. I should go through and rebuild everything.
Look how different that menu is.
Yes.
Yes, that's why we put all the work into the templates.
So step 1 is everything moves to the template. Step 2 is we agree on what should be in the menu and in the table of contents. And step 3 is we agree on better look and feel. We're on a journey. We're not there yet.
And is the what's in the tab what we're talking about on Friday? You know, which tabs must be there? Because like I see security as a tab in US Core and in QI Core, but I don't see it in others. And I'm just trying to figure out what we think should be there. Do we know?
On Friday, what I'm going to say tomorrow, what I'm going to say about security is the implementation guide should probably say something about that, and you should ask yourself whether it should and whether it should be easy to find. Now, actually, some implementation guides have good reasons to say nothing about security because of the nature of the implementation guides, whereas others should say a whole lot of stuff about security and don't. So what I'm going to say tomorrow is you should be asking yourself that when you are reviewing IGs. Today's discussion is, should you do that? And I actually have a list of 5 things for tomorrow that every implementation guide you should ask when you're reviewing it and when you're writing it, should I say something? Security, audit, provenance tracking. It's going to be more than 5 the way I'm splitting it up.
Great, I like your answer so far.
Safety, privacy and consent, and error handling. Error handling. I cannot slam the table enough about error handling. How many guides have we written that actually tell you how to handle errors? 0. Do implementers ever care about that? Nah. Nothing ever goes wrong. So those are that's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. That you should ask yourself: should the implementation guide be saying something about this? So, for instance, realm jurisdictional user guides probably shouldn't say anything about this, because it's like an implementation deployment thing, but like a actual EHR access probably should and probably does. Should the Da Vinci ones say? Depends on the nature of the exchanges they're talking about. Should like the breast cancer describing how to describe breast cancer? Probably not. It's irrelevant to talk about that because it's not talking about exchange. Okay. So you should ask the question.
So just follow-up question on that. Would it also be, an idea for the template that you should be explicit that there are no, considerations, so relevant considerations, and that way you should always include it to have that sort of look and feel?
That might be a good idea. I just think that that list that I rolled out, which I think was 7, the way I sliced it there, are all things an implementation guide should. You might say an implementation guide should at least say, I don't have anything to say about this, if nothing else. So that just used all the menu up. That's fine.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that we will need to talk about when we get to the point of talking about it is, if we want to say that, is there a way to say that doesn't necessarily use menu real estate and cause people to click on it and then get told there's nothing here and get annoyed because there's nothing there and they just wasted the click?
This page intentionally left blank.
Yeah.
It's a status thing.
Have the heading and have it disabled. Maybe. I don't know. No.
Then they'll say it's broken. Yeah.
Yep. Hundreds of tasks. Your security button is disabled.
So, not really looking at how it would look like. I don't care about that at this moment. Would it be possible would it make sense to do something on the computable side, like putting some constraints on the implementation guide resource itself to say this must be there or this kind of thing must be there?
If we get to the point of agreeing on what should be in the menu always, we can absolutely enforce that.
Like an expiry date, for example.
We can enforce anything that we can technically define if we have agreement on it. We just have to get to the point of having agreement.
Yeah, So I actually saw in some of the README file, they mentioned NPM package. So I didn't see any mentioning here. Is that something that automatically, the publisher builds it, or?
Yes. But there should, generally speaking, be a downloads page that says a little bit more than that.
But in fact, the NPM system is entirely automatic. Nobody does anything about that except the toolsmiths. It really doesn't matter whether you put a download in or not, because there's really no point in downloading an NPM package. If the tool wants the NPM package, it'll get it directly. It knows how to get it, it'll get it.
Well, it knows how to get it so long as you put your IG where you're supposed to.
Sorry?
So long as you put the IG where it's supposed to be.
Even then, I can still find it. Most of the time, if you register it, I can find it.
Yes.
We haven't talked about registration, so that's something else we should probably have a quick look at. But basically, you as an author have to do nothing with the NPM system. Sorry?
Is that part of the requirement to
Yes, but it's automatically, the files produced that you copy up are automatically meeting that requirement. But there's a little bit more to say about that, but we'll get back to that shortly.
Question about when you mentioned error handling. The thing that occurred to me was you in the code system section, you went through all this effort to emphasize that the vast majority of IGs shouldn't be needing to create new code systems, but rather maybe value sets. Mm-hmm. It seems to me, would you think when you start to create codes for handling errors, now you might increase the number of IGs that need to create their own code systems?
If the IG gets down to the level of detail of defining what the specific error code is going to be, and it's not as straightforward as simply saying here's the HTTP code to use, which those are already defined. So in FHIR, there's 3 different levels of error codes. There's the HTTP error codes, there's the operation outcome high-level codes, which are also standardized, and then there's the business level error codes, which tend to vary from server to server to server. So you would only need to put those in your implementation guide if you were in a community where you wanted to start defining the business level error codes, which you can do, but most of the IGs that HL7 defines aren't anywhere close to defining stuff at that level.
Mm-hmm. We have defined them for FHIR there.
Cool. Excellent.
So we do encourage IGs to find their codes from elsewhere. We're given a choice of not dealing with error handling or not defining codes. I know what I'd rather you do, which is define error handling.
So I'm just going to...
Just one thing.
Yep.
Can we get some conditional content? I'm thinking, for example, like we have the artifacts pages automatically generated. Could we have something like if there is a capability statement resource somewhere, then you also get your Swagger page build automatically, whatever. Can this be done? Not for this case, of course, but can this?
If code can do it, it can be done.
That's my question. Can code do that? I don't know.
Well, yes, code could theoretically do that.
We already generate Swagger automatically.
Yes.
So I'm just going to grab this for a sec. Can you go to FHIR.org?
Maybe we should let people have a break.
Oh, okay.
Good idea. All right. So we'll give you 15 minutes. It's 3:15. We'll pick up again at 3:30.